So, yeah. So I'm talking about asset template guides, and I'm actually speaking on two topics today. So this is my first one. My second one's at 3:20. So unlike 1 o'clock where there's a million things going on, and I'm thankful that you guys came to this presentation. So hopefully you're entertaining, or I'm entertaining, and you get something out of this. So my second topic is about style guides and really the process for creating style guides and how you can have reuse in your projects. And this topic, it's called asset template guides. It's a methodology that my friend Tim Bonderlow and I created. That was about 4 years ago when we worked at an agency together. And today we work together at the same company, and we've kind of evolved it. And the idea is really about creating responsive images and designing for the digital landscape. But it's also a way that designers and developers can work together and be collaborative. So there's going to be some design talk, but it'll be educational, and it will hopefully make you be better at communicating with your design partners and other people inside your infrastructure. So my name, as I said, is Kevin Mack. My Twitter handle is Nice Transition. I post a lot of content on Twitter, so if you're on Twitter, follow me. That's my plug. And I do a lot of educational videos, and I'm a part of many different organizations and communities, and I'm sharing a lot of the thought leadership that's coming out and developing specs and drafts of future states of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So very involved with that, and I post a lot of stuff. Also, if you have questions after, we'll have some Q&A. But if there's something that you think about later, you can always tweet at me, and I can put together a demo to make sure that the ideas are being clear. So I'm very active on Twitter. So giving you kind of a background on myself, I'm a very passionate person, and I really love what I do. So every single day, I'm excited to come into work and to make stuff and to work with people. I don't like working by myself. I like being around a group of people. So this is a photo of where I get a lot of my inspiration. So a lot of the ideas that I've developed and have created are actually through iterations of working with groups of people, coming to conferences, meeting people. So I love coming to places like this and meeting all the people I've met over the past 2 days. And through these conversations, I can bring up an idea and it can evolve and we can debate back and forth, but it just makes it better. This is actually a photo from one of the events that I run, so I'm there in the background, you can see me. But this is a Columbus Web Group. So Columbus Web Group is an organization that I started with my buddy Adam Weiss 3.5 years ago. And the idea was to provide free education to the community of Columbus. And we do monthly meetups that are methodologies, best practices, and approaches. And the idea is to inspire people. We also do free workshops. They're called weekend workshops. And they're on specific topics. And they become a personalized, contextual learning experience. So if you get into the class, we send an email, we say, what's your background, what do you want to get out of the course, and we base the course around you. And we advertise those through Twitter on CBest Web Group. And it's a really great community, it's a great network, and people there are really encouraging and inspiring. So that's a plug. My last little plug is I work at Cardinal Solutions. I'm our creative director, and I run our digital solutions. So that's digital strategy, digital branding, and project and team-based projects. And a wide range of different offerings and capabilities. So Cardinal does IT consulting and advisory services, and then I bring them all together for projects and trying to bring out creativity and innovation and utilizing some of the latest technology and design trends. It's a really great place to work, and I love it. And they've, let me do a lot of things that I don't think a company would usually do. And so the guy that worked with me on the methodology of asset template guides works with me at Cardinal. He's one of my best friends, and he's one of the smartest people I've ever met. His name's Tim Bonderlow. So getting into a timeline, this will be a bit of a history, but we'll start with myself. And then I'll be done talking about myself. So this isn't a presentation just about me, even though I could do that. So I started web development in 1995. Before 1995, I grew up in a house of art. So my mom was an art director. She worked at the Washington Post. So she always said that I could draw and design before I could even talk. I was actually a really quiet kid, so it's really odd to see that I love speaking at conferences and meeting people and being active in the community. But I loved art. I was incredibly passionate about it. And I learned how to do art naturally. In 95, I was also fortunate to grow in a house that had access to computers, and we always had computers. In 95, I started web development with one of my buddies, and it became this thing that I became absorbed in, and my life started revolving around computers. as things evolved, and I'll talk about the timeline of website development and design, I started merging my love for art and development together. And so today, and over my career, I've been a designer, a developer. I know multiple languages and worked on multiple different sides of the business. I've been on the client side, I've been in an agency, been a consultant, I've run my own business, I've been a part of startups. So with that, it all started in '95. And throughout this, I've worked on different specs and drafts and been active in the community of the internet. In 1996 was when Level 1 CSS came out. So this was the first introduction of CSS. And what the web actually looked like in that time period was something like this. So were any of you developing or doing any design on the web around this time period? Yeah. So you probably remember that the web wasn't that great. So this was like the early days of CSS, and it was just being introduced. So this is a screenshot of Apple's website in 1997. This would have been one of the best examples of a website design. Now it's kind of laughable to look at it, but the web was very young. Before then, it was just primarily like content pages. And the focus, even at this time period, was how we could design around the content and have information that could be accessed by people. And also, it goes without saying, Apple's really well known for their design. The one thing that really I don't understand about this is the BMW ad, because this is actually a screenshot from it. I don't know what that was. I don't remember that campaign. But there's some really funny things on this page. But this was one of the best designs that probably you could think about. In 1998, CSS Level 2 came out, or CSS2, as people say. And this is where positioning and some of the ways that you could move away from tables came into play. So we started talking about how you can organize your interface and provide the content. In 2001, media queries were introduced. And this was actually Level 3 selectors were first coming in, and more selectors were coming into play. CSS was evolving. In 2004, this was what was referred to as the Web 2.0 era. But that actually started maybe more in the '99. But this is when 2.1 CSS came out. And that's actually the last version of CSS, and CSS has different levels. So it's broken up into modules, and they release different new pieces. This is where the term like CSS3 came around. CSS3 doesn't really exist, but this is that time period where CSS3 was being introduced. The web started getting really funny at this point. This was also Flash, became almost on every website, skip intro, all that stupid stuff. Websites started looking like this. So this is a screenshot of the Microsoft website in 2007. Now, this is not by mistake how the screenshot's taken. So this is from the Wayback Machine. You can see that there's this blue space. But at this time period and the time period before, like in the Apple site, we were designing around 800 by 600. This was that time period where people talked about above the fold. So you can see most of the websites were designed to be around 1024 by 768. So above the fold probably would have been around here, because the traditional monitors would end right here. So a lot of the websites were actually left aligned and they weren't centered. And that was because monitors were way smaller. And we were trying to focus around just the traditional monitors that were out there. I mean, laptops were getting popular, but still a lot of people on the business side were still working on the desktop. Another thing, there were a lot of different things happening here. So instead of it being text and content, these were images. And image maps were being used and abused. Lots of horrible gradients, and people stopped really paying attention to some of the accessibility concerns. But the web was beautiful, and this was also the time that marketing departments started taking over websites. And it started being more of a marketing piece as opposed to a way to access content. Fun. 2007. This was the year that the iPhone came out, but between this time period and the last little step there was what was referred to as the M-dot years. So this is like the mid-2000s when the early phones came out. So I worked on the HTC campaign when HTC was first trying to come to America, and all the cell phone companies were trying to block them. HTC was the first real smartphone that had a really nice browser. And the iPhone came out in 2007, and some of the technology really started shifting because the M-dot became more and more popular, and everyone's like, we need to have an M-dot solution. Now, the huge gap and change was actually in 2010. Somewhere in that year, Ethan Marcotte wrote an article for a list apart that was called Responsive Web Design. So as I said, media queries came out in 2001. 9 years later, Ethan Marcotte wrote this article about responsive web design, and it was using the media queries to reposition your content and to create your website for mobile all the way through desktop, and having one code base as opposed to the MDOT solution where you had one site over here, one site over here, and manage and maintain 2 different projects. This was a big shift, and it changed the way that we started looking at web design and also thinking about development on the front end side, including the back end. Showing you kind of a level setting on the responsive landscape. This is referred to as the digital landscape. So in this graphic, you see small devices all the way to large devices and their sizes with it. So designing for responsive is you have one code base. As the screen gets smaller, it can adapt. But there's other factors that come into it. So responsive isn't just about the screen size. That's just one aspect. There's a bunch of contextual factors that are involved. So the way that people are interacting with them, the touch capabilities and features of these devices and browsers come into it. Things like keyboard and touch gestures. So I bring this up here because I think it's a really great graphic to demonstrate and show the digital landscape. And I say the phrase digital landscape a lot. I'm talking about not just the devices and the widths that change, but also the contextual factors. Sorry if I'm in your way.
No, you're fine.
You just got to kind of wiggle around it. All right, so that's kind of some of the prerequisites for all this and leading into this topic. So again, I'm talking about asset template guides. I'm going to do a bit of an alignment about content containers, and then I'm going to give you a definition, talk about the problems that asset template guides solve, where the inspiration of this methodology came from, the process for creating it, and how designers and developers work. And through that process, I'll be going through a demo. And then at the end, we'll talk about the responsive images and how they relate. So hopefully you get something out of this and you have at least an understanding of how you can collaborate and create a really nice website or design. So there's what's referred to, or what I say, as content containers and containers for content. They sound very similar, but this is really the 2 ways that you can look at building out an interface and designing for the web and how you're displaying the content. The first one, content containers, this is an example of it. So here we have this mocked up web page, but this area right here is demonstrating that content can flow. There are no restrictions to it. So this could have 100 words on it, or it could have 1,000 words. There's no character limits. This area is free flowing. So this is a content container. It's flexible, it's ready to flow. The container for content in this example is actually this blue box. So these are where you have limitations and restrictions on character amount, because if you have too little characters or too many characters, it breaks the design in the interface. So it says I'm a hero message, but if that said something like the message, it would look really odd and off balance. Same thing with the bottom line. If that was gone, that design would be broken. Now, there really isn't a right way or one's better than the other. It depends on the context of which you're using the content. And data grids and tables that are out there are traditionally more on the containers for content. And things like a blog article is the reverse of it. So you use them interchangeably in a design. And why I like to bring this up as just a quick lesson is it's related to some of the concepts that I'll be talking about. But it's also a really great way of thinking about how you're bringing in content and the different DOM elements that you'll apply your content to. All right, so that was a lot to get there. But recently I designed the album artwork for the band Mary Lynn and their new CD called My Animal. So this is a 3D rendering trying to show you the package. Now, there's some really cool things that are with this. So this is a 3-dimensional disc panel. So you can open it up. There's a CD that has plastic. You can take it off. You can close it. And on the side, it has this little label that says Mary Lynn, My Animal. Now, why I bring this up as an example, this could be really hard to imagine to do package design or print design if I had to just be like, all right, I want you to design this panel. How do I go about doing that? Well, here's the actual artwork for the CD. So it's set in these 4 corners. But the reason why it's set up this way is, like, this is the front cover, this is the back cover, this is that little side thing on the CD, this is the inside left panel, inside right panel. And the CD itself aligns to this cat. So when you lift up the cat, it's the same size. Now, I could have guessed a bunch of times, and I could have gone to the printer a million times and wasted a lot of time, effort, and money trying to get this right. But the printers have what are referred to as guidelines. So when you're working with a printer, they'll send you something like this. So this is the actual outline for how I should design this package. So it has where the folds are going to be in all the pieces. So this is layered on top of my design. So this design wasn't just me randomly putting 4 squares together. I had something from the printer that helped me to put this together. Now the cool thing about this is, if you go to a CD store, if anyone's still buying CDs, but if you can imagine going to like a record store or CD store, you can see all the different CD designs out there. But they're all really following, there's about 4 different types of CD panels that you can have. And this is a really common one. But each one looks unique and different, but they're all following that same template. Which gets me into what asset template guides are. So asset template guides is a methodology that my buddy Tim Bonwell and I created, and it's about crafting images or assets for the web or the digital landscape, and it's inspired by traditional print. So by traditional print, I also mean like package design, something like this, or design like a milk carton. There's a lot of rules and restrictions. But if you look at something like a website, so we're redesigning the Our Work section on Cardinal Solutions. Something like this, which doesn't look that complex, but if you were actually to develop it and think about the imagery of this, it could be a really complex thing. There's a lot of layering going on. This image is going underneath this text. There's an offset. There's a background, then there's an image center here. But what you can also do is apply the same kind of concepts of templates. And these templates are called as template guides. So this is actually the guides and how the images are made for this page and the templates that we've created for the redesign of Our Work. The cool thing is, by following these, we can do the same thing as going to a CD store and seeing all these unique, very different looks and feels, but following the same guidelines, and designers and developers can communicate and collaborate. So by the end of this presentation, you'll understand what this means and some of the rules around print and how it relates to responsive imagery. The 4 problems that we were trying to solve when we came up with this, and there's a lot more, but these are probably the biggest ones, is how content, the flow of content in a responsive landscape. So how you're predicting how something's going to scale, change. Imagery goes a part of content. So one of the biggest pieces of content is actually assets and imagery. And image and content should be speaking together. They should help communicate whatever that messaging is. But it's hard to predict what happens. So a lot of times you see a really great mobile side or a small screen and a really great desktop size. But then there's all this awkwardness that happens in between. Because to understand what's happening, you have to be almost a designer and a developer, or see it in the browser and prototype it. So that's one of the problems that this is aiming to resolve. The second is the creative freedom. So when responsive came around, a lot of designers felt handcuffed or confused about how to design and cut an image. There was a lot of production back and forth. Back to that CD example. If I didn't have those guidelines, that would take me years to get that right and to place those things perfectly on that folded edge. But the same thing happens on website designs. Communication between designers and developers. They're 2 leaders of 2 different crafts, but they should be working together. But a lot of times they're either siloed or they're having issues because their craft is not understood by the other craft. And I always say that designers should know about development and developers should know about design. They don't have to be a designer and developer. There's a difference between knowing what something is and how to do it. And understanding what your partners are doing is just as important as knowing how to do it. And responsive was really confusing when it first came out. Actually, all web design really was. But responsive highlighted that the 2 needed to be working together to make it right. And the fourth, and one that hits home for me, being from the agency side and the consulting side, site updates. So I finished this really awesome design. We hand it off to the client, and they're deploying it, and they made some updates. And they get that classic email, hey, the website launched, and you're really excited to check it out. And you go there, and the design's broken. And it could have been lack of communication or documentation, but a lot of times it's that same issue of the designer and developer. They add too much content in a zone that had restrictions or not enough, or the images that they put in are really small and they're not fulfilling the idea of it. I have a lot of examples of where that's happened in the past, and I'm not going to name those clients, but to this day, the imagery is still broken, and I thought, like, I should just call them up and fix it. But this is a major one that happens. So as I said, this was inspired by print design. In print design, there's 4 main pieces when designing for packaging in print that every designer kind of uses, but there's also a 5th one that comes into play. So these are the bleed, the trim line, the safety, the crop, and the fold. So on the right here is kind of an example of a CD insert, so how the CD would be designed. It's kind of layered back, so try to not make it too complex here. So the first one is the bleed. And what the bleed is in the printing process, you have printers that have these big pieces of paper or cardboard, whatever it is, some material that they're printing on. And then eventually they get cut and shaped to whatever the size is of your final product. The bleed is where you have this area that you're designing, and you want to make sure that your design is covering it from edge to edge, and there isn't any white space, or there isn't going to be an air at the end. So the bleed goes outside your design, and it's to make sure that the design is going from edge to edge. The trim line is where the sheet or the piece of paper is actually being cut in the printing process. So after the design's there, it cuts around it, and hopefully you went across this line so you don't have any white space or your design doesn't look broken. Safety is probably the most important piece. So there's a lot of inconsistencies that happen in the printing process. And the safety is a guarantee that no matter how inconsistent the printing or cutting process is in that printing process, that your image is going to show up. This is usually the main focus point of your design. And the other pieces just kind of extend, you work around them. The crop is related to the trim, but this is the actual area that indicates where the printer is going to be cutting the sheet. So the trim line is, as a designer, you know where it's going to be, but then this is actually where it's going to be cutting. So they're indications for the printer. The fold is where the actual design is, so if there's like folds or anything in the packaging that changes, and in the CD case, like looking at the inside panel, you don't want to have text on something like that because over time it will be worn down, or in the printing process it may get distorted. So it's an indication that you're going to have content or some kind of text there that may be interacting with something that's folded. It's also where die cuts happen or any cut away from the imaging process. So what we did was we took these, and this was a great guideline, and designers are very familiar with this. This is something that they teach in art school. Your design programs, Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, Sketch, all have these built in. So designers do this day to day, and this worked really well. And what we did was we said we could apply this to the responsive landscape. So that's my history lesson. So looking at a desktop, and imagine that this is just one image here. So this is going to be a layout. And a lot of times we're designing not entire pages, but sections. And the reason why we're designing sections is to making sure that we're prioritizing the content correctly, and the content and the imagery are going to be working together. So this is an image inside of a section. And then here's some content inside there. Now I'm going to go through and talk about how print is related to web. So we take this zone from that section, and we look at those same 5 things: the bleed, the trim line, the safety, the crop, and the fold. The bleed in Asset Template Guide is related to how it is on print, but this is the area that may be shown at certain landscapes and may not be shown at certain landscapes. So there's different effects that you can do with positioning. So as the browser window gets smaller, instead of scaling down the image, you have a piece of it that's going offside the screen. But as my browser gets bigger, I see more of that image. So the bleed is indicating at certain landscapes, the image will be not seen. So they're accent pieces. The trim line in an Asset Template Guide is not actually part of the image, but it's the browser itself. It's the viewport or the visible area of the monitor or the browser. Actually the browser. So it's the viewport. Safety is the most important piece. It's almost one-for-one as a print. So this is the main focal point of your design. This means it's going to be visible at any of the landscapes. So small screens and large screens. And this is the other pieces are just working to make sure that you have this nice layering effect and a really nice design. The crop is the actual dimensions of the image. So these are the, if it's a 900 by 400 image. So this is the physical image, the asset itself. So inside here, this is the section, but the image is actually here. You can see the content's actually layering on top of it. So it's offset on the left-hand side of the image to layer on top of it. But that's the full image. The fold is an area where you have content on top of your image. So as I said, this image is put behind it. And the reason why you indicate this is you want to make sure things like contrast ratios are high. So if I have white text, I don't want to have white imagery. This should be accent pieces. Again, similar to like a print, that insert in that panel. Those folding areas, I don't want to have my main pieces being disruptive. So this is an indication that there's going to be text on part of my image. So again, the idea here is to take this and to create really nice imagery and relate the content and the assets together. The process, and as I said, we'll talk about the demo. There's really 5 steps, but it aims towards a 6. And there's different people that own each steps, but it's this developer-designer relationship. It first starts with the concept, and that's owned by the design team. Second is a sketch. It's both designers and developers working together. Then it gets into structures, and this is where the main piece of this actually comes together, and this is in the development side. Then the team refines and takes those structures and makes sure that they align to the initial vision from the concept. And then the teams kind of go their own way, and they talk about, and they're aiming for reuse. And a lot of it is refining it and making sure that different modifications and variants can happen. So as I said, the first step is the sketch or the concept. Here's a layout of initial early days of us working on the artwork section. And the idea of this is to empower the designers to try to put together something that's really creative. Trying to put something out there that isn't restrictive. Doing whatever you feel like is going to be right and is going to be fitting for that brand and the essence that you have. So here's this image, and you can see it's kind of hard to see, but there's speckles in the background, there's a glow around here, and of course this image and the content off to the side. Now after this, and giving the design team creative freedom to create this section, the development and design team get together. And typically I like to print off things. I like physical paper because I like to draw. So this is an actual example of something I drew on. So the designer and developer sit next to each other, and they talk about where can this image actually live? There's this glow back here, but if we were to cut this actually, where would the actual image, that crop of it, exist? Can we offset it behind the text? Eventually, once the browser gets small, what do we want to do? So start talking about it in the responsive landscape. Do we want this? Is this important? Do we want it to start scaling, or do we want this to go off the screen? And then eventually scale. Once it gets to a smaller screen, do we want it to stack on top of each other, or do we want it to have some other type of treatment? But this is where we start talking about the responsive side as well as the design and how we can actually make this happen. And there's certain things that you can see, like there's a glow that goes outside this boundary. So we know once we get to the production and refining, we're going to have to fix that and come up with a way or a resolution that will work inside the browser. We're always aiming for that final deliverable. Now getting into the development structure. So this is the HTML CSS side. There's really no tricks or tips. What was I going to say? What's that saying? There's no tricks to this, no magic, but it's just positioning of CSS. And this image, there's different ways of doing it. You can use the transform translate to offset it. You can use a margin left, margin right. Those have different treatments in the responsive landscape as content's playing with each other. You can use a flex box to create this. So this is actually a 2-column grid. It's indicated by this dot line. So the content is on the left side and the image is inside the right side. And then this image is actually scaled up past its container size to give it this effect and then offset. So it looks like it has this layering effect where the content is behind the image is behind the content. So there's a lot of things that you can do with positioning in CSS. So going back to the highlighting of, and this is going to be a video demo, so this is actually a screenshot from my browser. Going back to the different layers of, or the guidelines for asset template guides. This pink or magenta border is the viewport. So this is the viewport of my browser for my screenshot. Inside here, the yellow is the crop of the image. So this is the actual size of the image. And a lot of these things, as you're developing them, you want to work in the worst restraints, but you can also talk about the positioning being vertical positions of top, middle, bottom, and adding those options inside there. And then what happens if you have a smaller image or a bigger image, how that's going to work together. And having conversations about the content off the left. This blue here is the bleed, and we actually use these colors. So these are in traditional print. Like blue usually stands for bleed. The magenta color is for the trim line, and the yellow is for the crop. So the blue is the bleed. But one of the things that we also do is we distinguish the difference between desktop sizes and mobile sizes. So the solid means that's for the desktop, where the single line strokes mean for mobile. So looking at this image, this is the indication that anything from here out will be cut off on mobile. So it's also guidelines for both desktop and mobile in a single image. The green is the solid area, is the safety area, and the green line here is for the mobile. If you have them both together, so a solid within the lines, that means it's available on both desktop and mobile. This is actually how you're going to be cropping your image and focusing on it on smaller screens. So that's kind of the walkthrough of all those different pieces. Now, as I play this video, you'll see once we get smaller, the bleed gets cut off. And this image keeps going and going. And once I get to this line, it's going to start scaling down. And the reason why we decided at that size to scale down was because that's what made sense for the context of that image and the content that it had inside. And then moving the image to the bottom. The idea of that initial breakpoint, too, of where this goes from the bottom to the right, was based off of the character limits that are on the left-hand side. Because I don't want to have just like one word or a couple characters that fit on a line. I want to make sure that it's still legible for the average user. So the idea here is to bring together these structures and relate it to the initial concept and what we had previously talked about and bring the development together. Now from there, we take those structures and we start refining. So the designer and developer maybe pair up and they bring in the assets and they fix some of those things. So here we take that image and we've now placed it inside that guide and we've updated some of the content to make sure that it works. And then you'll see that the image scales down. So some minor tweaks, but using a real example here. And this is also where you can start trying out variations of your example because the goal here is, again, to get to reuse. But having one structure across a site that can have multiple variations on it. And typically in a responsive landscape, you see that image starting to scale on that middle side, or once you hit this edge and then this image shrinks down. But then it's like on certain phablet sizes, this image is really small, but that content's really big. So this is aiming at making sure that your design looks consistent from the smallest of screens to the largest of screens. From here, the design gets into the refinements. And we've talked about the restrictions and how that template exists. And that template is something that the designers can be working around. The development team is working on the modifications. So those vertical, middle, center aligns, the alignment of the text being left or right, and also making variants inside of it, like the image on the left-hand side versus the right-hand side, because you can easily do something like that. So from here, looking at this, we've also trickled in additional functionality or CSS. So there's a solid background. It's actually a gradient, a subtle gradient. And then there's a background image of the specs, which is hard to see. But one of the cool things is using that asset template guide that the glow around this image goes behind that text. And it looks like it's consistently or put together. And it was made to be designed that way. And the other thing I like to call out is no matter what, even at this size, it looks like it was designed for this size. Once it gets to the 2-column look, even at this size, it looks like it was meant to be designed that way. No matter what size it is, the art direction was put forward, and we were able to take account for it. And I wrote a scaling library in just pure CSS, so once I get to my maximum width, I then also start scaling it up. The interesting thing that people think that once you get to a 56-inch monitor or a TV, that means you have more columns. When in reality, no one's sitting like 1 inch away from a 56 monitor. They're usually farther away from it. Things like projectors and TVs actually have a lower resolution because people are not sitting close to it. So text and things get bigger. So when you're designing for bigger screens, instead of trying to add more content, you increase the font size. And that's why I created that library. In this process, the developer and designer also work on creating the asset template guide in Photoshop or Sketch. So in Photoshop, they have what are called smart objects. In Sketch, they have symbols. And why these are really powerful is I can actually recreate what we had in the browser inside of Photoshop. So these become the Photoshop tools, and again, empowering the designer to utilize the tools that they're used to using. So at the top is the smart object, and then here's a desktop size. This is the traditional iPad size, 768, and an iPhone 320 size. And it's placed in there the exact same way that it's on the browser. So I can open up this one smart object, and I can design inside that smart object. So I can add that phone in here, and I can hit save, and then I can go back to my document and actually see how it's placed inside there, without ever, so the designer can work independently and work around those guidelines and know exactly how that content's going to flow. So as I said, the whole goal of this is to aim for reuse. And these individual pieces, even though these patterns may look complex, and the initial setup of the structures do take some time, but you can use it throughout an entire site. You can make small variations and modifications to it. And that same code that you test in one spot will work the same somewhere else, and you just can have unique designs working around these guidelines. I'm actually working on I've been releasing an open source project every month. I'm working on an asset template guide generator where you can mark how much you want to bleed and how big your content zone is and how many characters are in there, so it can generate those images for you and some of the structures. So I'm hoping to have that done by, probably won't be this month because I'm traveling a lot, but I'll have that out there sometime. So you can follow me on Twitter. But it's really, really powerful, and we use these on all of our marketing sites and public facing, and they're really helpful. The big thing that I would say the takeaway with all this and the thought behind this is letting experts lead their craft and having the right people on the right project at the right time and collaborating. These ideas and concepts wouldn't happen if I wasn't paired up, or if the developer isn't paired up with the designer, or the designer isn't paired up with the developer. And if not, a lot of the websites out there, especially responsive to this day, are very rigid designs, they're very boxy, they're not very fulfilling from a visual standpoint. And I think we've all gotten smart enough and we have the technology capabilities to make really nice designs. So I have that example, it's on my code pen. I actually have a rewrite of it, so it's a little bit of older code. I'm releasing an open source project, which is a skinless UI toolkit and framework. So it's a development kit. It's based off of some of the concepts behind Inuit CSS, but the idea is that you can develop around different structures and content and add your own theming. So my presentation later on, I'm talking about style guides. So it's a global layer style guide that will be an open source project and include all my different open source projects that I've been working on this year. So with that, this is just the demo from today, and I also include the Photoshop file in there just as a reference point. They don't need to be as complex as that example. Sometimes just having the fold is all you really need, just to give you that layering effect. Now, kind of shifting into a topic that's related to this, and where this was really evolved from. So I was part of the responsive images community, which is now the responsive issues community. I worked on the use cases for the picture element and source set. And there's 3 primary use cases for it. And I'll go through each of them. But with it, the biggest thing about the responsive images, they were really about optimization and not art direction. But you can use the asset template guides in combination with responsive images and making sure that you're serving up the right content at the right speed, bandwidth, and size that you need. So following those templates, you can just output them at different sizes and prevent people from downloading something really big. So the first use case that's there is the pixel ratios. This one is a really easy one to understand. So this is the new attribute that came out from the responsive images. And just so you know, it's not really called the picture element. A lot of people refer to responsive images as the picture element, but there's two pieces in responsive images. It's this new attribute, which is source set, and also the picture element that's in there. But if you're talking about images that are responsive, refer to them as responsive images because it confuses people. And in reality, source set gives you most of the use cases that you need. So if anyone ever asks, like, should we use picture element, the physical picture element, or source set, 99% of the time you're going to be using source set. So in this example, pixel ratios, the source set here is the new element, and here we have image-large.png, and the pixel ratio is this 2x. So this means that if my browser or my monitor has a 2 times pixel ratio, so like your Retina screens that are out there, you can serve up a 2 times image. So you can get the Retina image showing. And then if you want to, you can just put a 1x, or you can also do a 1.5. A lot of people just aim for 1.5 and then fall back to a default. I actually don't need to put 1.x or 1x because it falls back to it. So I can just say 2x and just put image.png. And then the fallback for traditional browsers is you have your traditional source, which is part of the image element. So this will allow for Retina images or Retina screens to serve up a larger image. And if I don't have it, I'm not serving it up. And if my browser doesn't have the capability, it falls back to the smaller version of it. So that's the first one. The second one, and this one's a little bit confusing. And some of the calculations have changed, and it's really inconsistent from browser to browser. But this is referred to as viewport base selection. The viewport base selection, so first off, did that make sense about the source set, the 2x, 1x? All right, so source set is looking at this new measurement. It's called widths. Now, just out of curiosity, what do you think a width means in source set? If you're not familiar with this at all, that makes it even better.
Is it the ceiling?
The calculation for it also has recently changed, which makes it really confusing, and it's different from browser to browser.
Oh, well, you mean the unit of measure?
Yeah.
Is it pixel or M?
It's not.
No. Okay.
Width is a new measurement, and width here, so 16W, is supposed to be the output of your saved image. So image large, this could be 1600 by 800. So that's the actual size of the image. But how width is actually calculated, it takes into account pixel ratio as well as viewport size and the image size. So that's what's really confusing about it. There's 3 different measurements that are inside of it. Firefox doesn't look at pixel ratios, and the purpose of this is that you serve up the lowest resolution image that you need when you hit it. But as you go bigger, you download the next one that you need. But if I start from a big screen, say a browser that's over 1600 pixels, and in the case of 1600 pixels on a Retina display, my browser only needs to be 800 pixels wide, or my viewport is only 800 pixels wide. So 8 times 2 is 1600. So if I'm over 800 pixels or equal to it, then I serve up the 1600 pixel. So the medium here is, this image is 800 width and 400 width. So it's almost impossible to serve up a 400 width image nowadays, because browser windows, the smallest that like Chrome will go is 400. And to mimic a non-Retina, so if you're using a really old screen or a really old mobile phone, maybe you can hit the 400, but most likely if you're under 640, you're never going to see it, because most phones are Retina. The idea here is to serve it up, and once you hit and download the largest one, you have that cached inside the browser, and you don't ever see the smaller version. so if I download the large one, I will never see the medium or the small version. That one's cached in my browser. It's really, really powerful and cool. And it makes it really hard to test though, because you have to test in incognito mode and have your browser at the specific sizes to get it to work. And test on Retina and non-Retina devices, which is, again, almost near impossible for the small ones. But why this is so powerful is I have just this one thing that is serving up variations of these images that is right in the context that it's needed. And it does the calculation for me and saves the bandwidth. There's some additional work that's coming on here to not just look at the width, but also incorporate bandwidth and looking at the user's actual connectivity to their source. So whether they're on Wi-Fi or connected over 4G, 3G, and serving up the right image. So this is probably one of the best ways to implement responsive images. And again, it works with the concept of the art direction for the asset template device. Sizes can use media queries, but they use really weird measurements, and it's actually an optional attribute. The spec says you should use it, but in reality you can get rid of it. You can't use pixels and you can't use percent. Well, some browsers allow you to use pixels. You're not supposed to. They're supposed to be things like ems and relative measurements, and VW stands for viewport width, so it means it's 100%. You can still add classes to an image and give it art direction that way, but this is just like the best way of doing it. And of course, there's a fallback for old browsers to load the smallest image. That one's the most complex. This one's probably the second easiest one to understand because pixel ratios is just one piece, but this is the one that's the picture element. And it's really referred for art direction. And why I was really opposed to this when it first came out, this was the first element that was created for HTML that was actually about art direction. Everything else in CSS, HTML, and JavaScript was always about building out an interface and giving the freedom to however you wanted to combine it. And this guy has what's referred to as the picture element, and it has these sources inside of it, and then a fallback to an image. So it first looks at media attribute and looks at the media query inside there. And if your browser fulfills the needs of this media query, then it serves up this image. I can still use pixel ratios here, so I can use 2x and also 1x, which is nice. But once I get smaller and below it, it then downloads this image and changes it out. So this is used a lot of times for, I have this huge image on desktop, but then on mobile I just want to show something else. Where this gets difficult is, and it's really hard, especially working with the content management system, I have to manage and maintain not just one image, I have to manage and maintain multiple images. Where the previous one, a lot of content management systems and servers, you can generate those variations of the image, so the smaller sizes. This, I actually have to make multiple components. There are use cases for it, it's just a little bit more limiting.
Forgive a novice question.
Yeah.
But how does it know when it's going to like a mobile device as opposed to a desktop?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So how the browser calculates the difference between the mobile versus desktop, it doesn't care. So designing for responsive isn't designing from like a user agent saying, is this an iPhone, Android, or whatever it may be. It's looking at a condition of width. And media queries, there's features and types. Feature when you're designing and how picture element works is looking at screen. And the condition that picture element works with is width, and min width, max width. There's a few other ones that you can use, but all that's saying is if my browser has, if it's above 800 pixels here, serve this image. If it's below 399, serve this image. And that's all it's saying. So you're never defining it, it's just the condition of, is this going to be met? And you can have multiple inside here. Does that help you understand? It's just a part of CSS.
Yeah, I think so. It sounds like it's querying the device, and if it's the size is like 800 pixels,
Yep, and those are just referred to as media queries. But This can also be used with asset template guides. So as I talked about, those green lines for desktop, or the thick being for the desktop, and those green lines being for mobile. If you really wanted to optimize for mobile, you can set up things in Photoshop and Sketch to actually crop your images in slices. So I could actually generate from one image the desktop version of it and the mobile version of it, and cut off the edges from the bleed marks that I don't need on the mobile or smaller screens. So that is something that you could do and relate the two, but I kind of advise not using this. It's one of those weird specs that made it through, and this was one of the biggest reasons, even though picture element or responsive images was fast-tracked, it took many years to get it there, and the reason why it took so long was because of this guy. So it's kind of a confusing topic. So any questions? I know I chatted a lot, and I know that there's probably more on the development side here, but any questions or anything that I can clarify?
I was just going to ask you about just for those images. That tag I'm not at all familiar with, but where I have came across it is if we just have a whole bunch of images and I'm wanting to make some kind of slideshow, and they're in all different dimensions and all different sizes.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I really came across that as a potential solution, just so I could make it dynamic and they're not trying to squeeze in some kind of container of sorts. How is best to handle those scenarios?
So in that case, there's two different ways of doing it. The most supported is using it actually as a background image, and there's a CSS property that says, I can't think what it is, it's a background position, but the value is covered. So you can cover it so it fulfills it, but that only works for a background image. Oh my goodness.
So
use it all the time. But it's
yeah.
called background fill. But its cover is one way of doing it.
Okay.
But if you have an element that's an image, what you can use is a newer CSS property is object fit, and you can have it equal to cover, and it scales it to the aspect ratio to fulfill the needs of that container.
Okay.
Yeah, and you don't have to worry about kind of maxing it or maximizing it.
Mm-hmm.
The third and more complex, but it's also this works all the way back to IE8, is using intrinsic ratios. And intrinsic ratios are where you create aspect ratios for non-image types. So it keeps if you have a 4x3, it will scale down. It's a trick that you set the height to 0 and you set the padding. So if it's 3x4, you set the padding to 75%, and then it becomes a 3x4 scale from the browser. And then you can make your image be 100% width, and you can also then turn off the overflow so it fulfills it. There is a new spec for CSS to have aspect ratios so we don't have to use things like intrinsic ratios or some of the hacks that are out there.
Yeah.
But object fit is probably the easiest way for you.
Okay. Thank you.
Any questions? I'm kind of curious to know what I'm really bothered by it. That I can't think of it. But again, I'm at Transition on Twitter, and I also have a quick little demo just because I know the responsive images are kind of confusing, and if I had time, I was just going to quickly show you this. So here is, my desktop. Here is just a little demo that I put together last night. So right here, it's bringing in the large one because screen is actually 2 times. So weird things with monitors, it's calculating off my machine. So if I didn't have Retina, this would be bringing up a small image. Now this guy is that confusing one, and it brings in the large one because I already have it cached. So you always see it from any size that it's always bringing the large one. But if I were to open this guy up in an incognito window and make it really tiny, I will be downloading the medium-sized one here, I bet. So if I scroll down, this one, it brought in the small one. So this has a small one, but now if I refresh this page and I go here, it's still small. But if I make it bigger, why it's not doing that? Oops. Oh, wait a minute. Did I screw that up? But basically, based off of my initial hit on this page, it downloads the right one. Let me demo that one more time. I may have been looking at the wrong one. So here we have this one being small, but then it goes to medium because my browser now is hitting this, so it downloads that. And now if I go smaller, it stays to medium because it's bringing the biggest quality image. Now if I go larger, it will download the large one. And now if I were to refresh this page, as opposed to getting the small one, I get the large one cached inside there. So that's how that one actually works. It's, again, really confusing. Different browsers do it differently. So Firefox, actually, as you go smaller, even though you have the big one downloaded, it will switch it out. The last one is probably the easiest one to comprehend. So I have, this is using the picture element. Oh, I can't go any bigger. But basically, as it gets smaller, I can switch out the image. So it's always looking at the viewport size and rendering the right one. That's how that works. Yeah, so that's about it. Again, any last minute questions?
So basically, do you have a unique asset guide for each page? Depending on images
Yeah,
content?
so typically I make 3 to maybe 4 different asset templates and variations on them. So there may be actually 3 that I set up.
Project.
Yeah, and then utilize them across. And they're usually unique per whatever the needs are, because you're initially basing the assets and the imagery off the content that you have. And back to the containers for content containers, it could still work in that environment. And you would probably want to create a different guideline for it. But try to keep it, I try to keep them as minimal as possible and utilize it. Well, thank you guys. Appreciate your time.